what of course we've seen, and you might have experienced that in the last month, that of course the COVID crisis with various lockdowns, different, it was good and bad for different sections of the industry. So we could see that the lockdowns was brilliant for big streaming services. So Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, all of them have actually reported substantial increases in revenues, okay? And of course, that's crucial for us in the music industry because many of us have our content that we produced on those streaming services. There was also an exponential increase of consumers for these online streaming services. And of course, you will see yourself also in that sector, music audiences, through laptops, through smartphones, we were able to access free music from all sorts of different things. And of course, during the lockdown, if my experience is anything to go by, I was able to go to events virtually that I wouldn't have been able to go if I had to go there physically. And the statistics seem to indicate that audiences increased because they had more easier access to these events. So it was actually, in some strange way, also good for music audiences who wanted to experience diverse cultural offers and music offers. For labels and music record companies, especially those that had negotiated contracts with the streaming services, their revenue stayed stable or even increased. So they were also okay. So in some weird way, the lockdowns were actually specifically bad for artists, and specifically artists who actually had to now rely on streaming income because their live income was suddenly falling away. So all the concerts were, of course, live music completely collapsed. And that created a situation where suddenly individuals realized, especially artists, musicians, and you saw that probably in the news, musicians who had an income from live concerts, from other sorts of revenues, whether that's selling merchandise at live concerts or whether that's having all sorts of different kinds of licenses. Suddenly, most of the income was coming from their streaming, from their, from their content, which was on the streaming platforms. And it was actually many of them, and you might have seen that in the press, many of them were shocked how small that income actually was. So actually, in some ways, the COVID crisis and the lockdowns demonstrated how unfair and unequitable remuneration there was actually there from streaming. And of course, that hit the music sector also quite hard. And of the most hardest hit industries within the creative industries, the most hardest hit sectors actually within the UK economy, it was actually the creative industries and tourism. And, what was reported, just some numbers, 31% turnover loss compared to 2019. So these figures all come from sort of projected economic impact done in June 2020 from Oxford Economics, which is a big company which does a lot of sort of impact measures and projections, economic projections. And in a nutshell, and I try to, some of you will know that in and out, but in a nutshell, I sort of try to depict, what the issues here are and what has been discussed. And of course, we know that artists in generally, specifically if they want to go with a mainstream label, they have a contract with that label. And actually consumers have a contract with the streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube and TikTok. And then it's actually the labels or the record companies which have hidden negotiations and contracts with the streaming platforms. So one of the things that came out of this inquiry was how much they felt in competition with each other. They didn't want to answer the questions in relation to these contracts because they felt they were competing with each other. So they said, I'm going to give that confidentially, but I'm not going to say it out loud here because it's a public document and it's part of our market edge that we negotiate these contracts individually. And I think that also provides a big problem because the lack of transparency means that artists just don't have any leverage. They first of all, their contracts are also quite often based on non-disclosure agreements, so they can't talk about the requirements for their contracts, but also what the labels negotiate with the streaming platforms that hold the artist's content. They don't know those negotiations, so they can't actually make an argument that I'm not getting enough for my streamed content. So there is a lot of lack of transparency. And if I would say what I heard in those mornings of how the record companies are actually arguing, it's probably fair to say that they're on the one hand very, very defensive. They said it's how the market works, so that the competitive does not allow transparency of those contractual cultures. There was a lot of blame going on. It's not us, it's the streaming platforms. And this notion of safe harbor agreements doesn't allow us to remunerate artists as good. So, it's not us narrative. There were also victim narratives, so the big labels, of course, that said we managed to come out of the industry crisis. So if you remember, 10 years back, 15 years back, there was a whole discussion about the music industry is with streaming is going, going out of work. And they had these narratives in there. We managed to come out of the industry crisis by negotiating with streaming services. And, to me, of course, that means that they equate the music industry with the labels only, forgetting that, all of us are part of the music industry. So it's an interesting aspect. There was a narrative which suggests you don't understand. You don't understand how that works. It's so complex. Automatic licensing or equitable remuneration, which would be a better way of doing it for artists. It doesn't quite work like that. Streaming is not radio. That was an argument which was mentioned again and again. Then there was an argument that it will automatically get better because streaming is still on the increase. That means that artists who are at the moment not making a living from their streaming services, whilst they already have, thousands and thousands of downloads, in the future, they will have more downloads and they will be able to sustain themselves. They also had an argument that if you change the way things are, you will destroy the industry. So the UK needs to stay competitive. We've lived through the decline. We are starting to grow. But of course, again, the industry has grown. It's rather the labels, it's equating, the labels are equating themselves with the music industry, and it's just one part of the industry. So they have these survivor narratives and this blame culture as well. And I think, again, for me, and I'm going to go into that just now, this means that big labels are hung up on business models which come from this culture 2.0 context. So culture 3.0, we still have digital content production, we still have digital connectivity, and we have these ubiquitously available production tools. We have mass distribution of content without mediators, open platforms, social media, co-production, often being democratic co-production. I'm going to emphasize that, co-production, because, of course, there's constantly shifting roles of content producers and users. And, some of the examples, and again, it becomes very, very easily understandable. For those, some of you might have played massive online multiplayer online games, Destiny. I've got Destiny down there. So of course there's a company who creates that game, but there are loads of users who produce artwork, who produce videos of their plays, who produce debates on YouTube, and it creates its own revenue. So who's the content producer and user shifts? These roles are shifting almost all the time. And of course, also culture no longer is an aspect of free time, but it's entrenched in fabric of daily life. So we don't have to make time to go to a concert anymore. We've got Spotify, we've got Band in a Box, we've got our smartphones everywhere. So it's completely entrenched. And as an example, here's, of course, the leaf trombone. I don't know if you know that. It was an app which, gosh, is now probably 10, 12, 14 years old or something like that, maybe not quite as old like that, but you blow into it and it's like a leaf trombone app, and you can have an impromptu concert with 5, 10, 50 people all over the world just from one moment to the other. So there are no predetermined market channel bottlenecks in relation to that. And as another example, of course, SoundCloud fits into this kind of ecosystem as well. With that, we have a blurring of active and passive participation. So I'm not, I might be listening to a podcast one moment, and the next moment, hey, I'm uploading a podcast with something. So it becomes very difficult to understand, who's the producer, who's the consumer. And of course, this prosumer, that concept of the prosumer comes in there. This technological innovation allows massive shared and shareable production of content instant diffusion and circulation. And of course, the production of value moves to the social domain. So we are, that ability to engage musically or creatively, it works in all sorts of lives, and it helps us to function in a social domain. And of course, there are sort of evidences how it connects to all sorts of civic functioning, innovation, of course, welfare, sustainability. So, all these kinds of things. We know that specifically in terms of welfare. We know certainly, if my experience anything to go by, music kept me sane. Online access to music and arts kept me sane through various lockdowns. As an example, I should actually say I've got here Imogen Heap as well, and her mycelia, which is putting distributed ledgers into a sort of system which allows then a co-sharing of the revenue created to everyone who's involved in that. So if you think culture 3.0, co-production, that's the key point there, then you've got that concept. You understand that concept. And of course, there are sort of, I should actually emphasize that I've given a lot of examples which are digitally enhanced. And of course, digital availability does support Culture 3.0, but it doesn't have to be. There are other ways which I would say are typical Culture 3.0. So if you think about participatory street festivals, where you spin a story with theater makers, but the audience is part of the story. That's typical, in my opinion, Culture 3.0. Or this Wollenkladen piano. Now, from a Culture 1.0, some people might say, "Wow, is this art? Is this really art?" And of course, you now don't have to define it as art. You can say, "Well, it's Culture 3.0. It makes all of our lives a bit more creative. Who plays on it, who listens to it, doesn't matter. It just makes that living here in this space a bit more creative, and that's fine, and it creates value for us." So that's Culture 3.0. So, just in a sort of kind of, concluding towards that, and these are all sort of examples of where this cultural engagement, the evolution of cultural engagement kind of moves towards to. So we have Culture 1.0, think patronage. Culture 2.0, think copyright. Culture 3.0, think co-production. And I've got here some examples. We move into this Culture 3.0. So of course, crowdfunding allows, is in that ecosystem. Podcasting, because there are feeds that nobody can gatekeep. It's very democratic, falls into that. There are also, the alternatives to Spotify, Deezer. And of course, we've got a sort of alternatives to Spotify, Sonstream and Stoke-on-Trent, which was an independent label initially, but is creating a sort of remuneration system which pays per play, and pays also the artists per play. So there are things on the move here, which is very interesting because it fits in my concept under Culture 3.0. Now, I should actually emphasize that I'm not advocating that we all move to Culture 3.0, but that we need a balance. We need a healthy ecosystem which has Culture 1.0 types of cultural engagement, Culture 2.0 kinds of cultural engagement, as well as Culture 3.0. So, of course, if we have now an industry strategy which only supports Culture 2.0, we're missing out on the future. And I think that's what, the current industry strategy deal is actually doing. We're missing out in the cutting edge. But it also means for us individually, do we want to support business models like, Sony, UK? Do we want to support record companies that are still so immersed in Culture 2.0, rather than looking at, are there models that allow me to go into the future in relation to that? And I would actually, you could conceptualize these also in terms of a different type of context. You could contextualize Culture 1.0 as sort of high individualism. I'm not going to go into that too much. The cultural turn is, of course, where suddenly the creative industries become very important, and creativity as such and IP becomes very important. In co-production turn, there are a lot of people in the business world and the economy already talking about this co-production turn, that the economy is turning to co-production means, and that's going to be more in the future. But it's the question of if we're going to let Asia sort of monopolize that concept. It's already coming quite strong in relation to that. Of course, 1.0, the center was Europe, 2.0 was the US, and I would say the UK, specifically the music industry.
In terms of Culture 3.0, what is the problem with music production and education? What do we have to do?
Oh gosh, You know, I could do another talk about University 3.0. I have this concept about University 3.0, which basically maps out how the future universities, you know, need to look like, or what they could look like. And of course, you know, Ras, you will know what I'm going to say. It's about partnerships, especially in the music industry. It's about allowing education, you know, that we're the environment where learning happens, but where we don't own the knowledge, because the knowledge is all around us, as we know. And yes, we might be very much experienced, so we can facilitate the learning within the university setting in environments like these, which is a fabulous opportunity for learning. But actually, we want to get externals in there as well. And that's still quite hard with our current education system, because it's built on a University 1.0 and 2.0 kind of context where we build walls around us. So the idea for us, the ideal university for me, is rather where we can bring industry professionals into the environment very much easier. And many of us do that. And I know that, you know, in your university, you do that quite a lot, but you will probably also know how difficult it is to fill out the contracts, to fill out the payment system, and how difficult that is. And then also for the individuals who come in, how difficult it is to manage that dialogue with the university, which is a multi-headed kind of beast. You know, so it's so I think it's about rather understanding partnerships and together forming that learning environment in which we all at different levels learn about our, you know, our sectors, our futures.
If you've got any thoughts on this, Carola, what sort of technologies do you anticipate emerging to support a co-production model in the future? And will these provide a significant challenge to the more centralized economic models for music production?
Yeah, and I had actually promised in the abstract to talk more about distributed ledgers, and Ras actually pulled me up on that, and I didn't talk about distributed ledgers, which is a bit of a shame. So I'm really sorry that I didn't actually cover it. But the answer, I would say, has actually to do with distributed ledgers. And just in a nutshell, you know, why it's so important is that at the moment, if you think about contracts between artists and labels, contracts with band members amongst themselves in terms of agreements, quite often it's a one-to-one negotiation, and the one-to-one could be organization versus individual, or organization versus organization, or individual versus organizational, but all of that are one-to-one negotiations, with each of the negotiations having to have a lawyer involved in that. And the smart contracts, which are part of the distributed ledgers, what they actually do is where you have an electronic digital system where you specify who's involved in your producing. So you have this network of individuals who might actually feed into your final album, your final, and you map that value chain. You know, you say, yes, that person has done, you know, 0.5% of the contribution to that, and that person has 30%. And that means that when it gets to the point of selling, and let's say you had something like Etsy for musicians, you know, and somebody buys an album, or somebody buys a T-shirt from a concert that they went to, you know, that value chain is embedded in there, and that already then dribbles down to each member that is in that value chain. That changes the complete way we remunerate, we co-own. It changes the way we can understand our contributions and feel that we're part of something. Now, again, you know, the big labels, none of them have actually looked into it. It's actually individuals like Imogen Heap, as we mentioned. She set up a system like that. And of course, these distributed ledgers with these smart contracts are being at the moment taken up more on the digital side. So digital technologies, artificial intelligence companies, augmented reality companies, and it will probably be taken up in the film industry more than the music industry, because we're so hung up in 2.0. But I think that will change everything. And of course, at the moment, there are struggles going on in relation to that. You know, one example of that struggle is, if you take, for instance, podcasting. So if those of you who know how podcasting works, there's an, you know, sort of a feed which allows anyone to get that feed. So if I put my podcast up, you know, it can be, you know, you can see it from Spotify, you can see it from Apple Podcasts, you can see it from various different kinds of players. Now, there's a struggle going on at the moment because Spotify has said, we're going to do podcasts, but without the RSS feeds, without those feeds, which then begs the question, is this still a podcast or not? in my contextualization, that struggle is about not doing the democratization, not allowing a sort of co-owning of the process. And it's rather putting gatekeeping in. And then it would be Netflix for audio rather than a podcast, what they do if they take away that feed. So there are these struggles going on. We can see, you know, in my contextualization, how I understood it, and it's my way of understanding it, rather than thinking about these companies just want to make money, it is rather these different business models, which are sort of Culture 2.0, big business types of models where you keep control over the IP versus those business models which actually value co-production, co-ownership. And of course, there are loads of aspects in relation to that. So I think what's going to come is, you know, as I said before, the co-production model is going to come on strong, and it has already, you know, even Patreon, you know, getting funding through Patreon is part of that, yeah, exactly, ecosystem. But yeah, so where does it go to? We'll see. But I think there are real opportunities, and to be aware of those is going to be really useful to position yourself. And individuals might want to just simply do a traditional, I'm going to start a new label and I'm going to do 2.0, and that's fine. And I'm going to do fair remuneration as well within that model. And I'm not going to use sort of co-production methods. And maybe that's fine. But there might be opportunities to really go strong into the other direction and say, well, how would that look like?